Hey everyone, it's Tim from timgagnon.com. Welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to do is talk about 3 tips to make your sunsets more bright and more powerful. But before we get into the tips today, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notifications bell so you know anytime a new tips and tricks video comes out. Also, if you get a chance, make sure you check out timgagnon.com. The link is right here in the video. On that website, I have hundreds of online painting lessons from me and other artists. You can learn paintings like this from start to finish in the comfort of your own home. So let's get into the tips and tricks for today. This painting's not quite finished yet. I still have a lot more on the foreground and a lot more details to do in the upper part of the clouds. But I wanted to make this video since I just worked on this sun and the sunburst and really brought up the contrast. And I was like thinking, I should make a video on how I create that contrast. So there's 3 major things I do to create the contrast of a bright sunset. So tip number 1 is to use complementary colors. So complementary colors are like orange and blue, or yellow and violet, or red and green. So there's lots of complementary colors. There's also close complements. Close complementary color would be something that's kind of blue and something that's kind of orange. So what I like to do in sunset paintings is use multiple complementary colors, because when you have complementary colors together, it increases the contrast of the painting. So contrast you can think of as values like bright and dark, which we'll talk about in just a second. They also have to do with colors and saturation of color. So if you've got a bright blue and a bright orange, it creates contrast. So in this painting here, what I did is I used a lot of violet and purple up here in the clouds, and I used this really bright yellow down below. That creates nice contrast. Then I used a lot of obvious kind of turquoise blue, which is kind of a close complement to orange. But then what I did is I used actual blue in little pieces to complement that orange. So using those complementary colors really makes the colors pop a lot more. And you don't want to do that in every painting, but sunsets are really bold and beautiful, so you want to really bring the colors out as much as you can. So tip number 1, use multiple sets of complementary or close complementary colors within the sunset. So tip number 2 is kind of along the same lines, except we're going to talk about value contrast. So tip number 2 is to increase the contrast in your values. So what you want to do is have a lot of darks and at least have a bright white or a bright light color. So this whole painting, I would say, is kind of a mid-range value. Down here there's a couple darker values, and then down below this hill here is pretty dark. It's relatively dark on the value scale. And what I did is I created the sun, and I used really, really bright white just on the sun itself. I used values that were slightly lighter here, illuminating the area around the clouds, but I used pure white within that sun to create the contrast. So a lot of times I feel like I see some sunset paintings and the contrast isn't pushed enough, or people try to use like black to create contrast, which it can kind of work, but black is really flat, so it's not quite as effective when trying to create atmosphere in a sunset. So to increase the contrast, you want to look for dark values that are close to light values. A lot of times the open sky area people make a little bit too bright, and that way the sun doesn't look quite as bright. So you want to make sure that you're not making any open sky really, really, really bright, because that's going to kind of decrease the value range for your sun. So tip number 2 is increasing the values with the lights and darks. And remember, tip number 1 was the contrast between your complementary colors. Okay, so tip number 3 is to make sure that you're carrying light throughout your painting. So a lot of times we think of the sunset, the sun setting down below the clouds or just above a hill. It's really bright and beautiful down here, but we don't really think about all the stuff up here as much. So in a sunset, you can see the sunbeams coming up through. What you want to do is take some of these colors down here and subtly put them up through the clouds up here. So you can see I used a little bit of orange on the clouds just underneath, and so that light is coming up underneath the clouds, illuminating levels of the clouds underneath. Even way out here, you want to have little hints of color from down here up through here, even way up here. So make sure you're expanding that light throughout. It's going to make the sun look like it's carrying the light a little bit further and make your sunset a lot more powerful. A lot of times I see sunset paintings, people bring the light up a little bit, but then they forget to add in little elements of it up here. So just remember, bring that light further throughout the painting. It doesn't have to be white, it just has to be some of these colors down here up throughout the rest of the painting. Okay, to recap really quickly, tip number 1 was to use multiple sets of complementary colors. It doesn't have to be direct complements like orange and blue. It could be turquoise and yellow orange, which would be also a close complement. But using multiple sets of those complements or close complements is going to make your colors pop. It's going to have more contrast. Tip number 2 is to increase the value range. So you want to have some dark darks and a really light light somewhere. Like I said, I reserve my brightest white for right here on the sun, but maybe you do it somewhere else in the painting. But if you have that large range of values, it's going to just look more powerful. And tip number 3, for sunsets, make sure you're carrying the light, even though it's really exaggerated here, you want to carry it all throughout the painting. You don't want to just stop halfway through and then have nice clouds. You want to make it look like that light is carrying up through all the way throughout the entire painting. So as an added bonus, what I'm going to do is just have you watch me do a little time lapse here of how I created this sun. And I'll have a little bit of music playing, but make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notifications bell. I really appreciate all your comments down below, and thanks for tuning in again today. Okay, during this time lapse, I'll be using a fan brush and a small round brush, which you can find as part of my brush set on timgagnon.com. So also for the colors, I'm going to be using our cad yellow, cadmium orange, and titanium white. I'm going to start here at the sun, work my way out, and then build up that contrast I was talking about earlier. So let's get into that time lapse.